A lot of the time, whenever we read the Old Testament, we come to this inevitable question: what is with all the wives? Why do all these guys have multiple wives? Is the Bible okay with polygamy? If you read the Old Testament, you see character after character that takes multiple wives. And it's not always the bad guys. A lot of the time, it's the good guys. A lot of the time, it's guys like King David that the Bible describes as a man after God's own heart. And yet, he had at least 8 wives. And another tricky thing about it is a lot of the time whenever it describes that, it says so-and-so had multiple wives, and then it doesn't put anything in there that says, and they shouldn't have had multiple wives. It doesn't say, David shouldn't have had 8 wives, he should have only had 1 wife. It doesn't make it explicit there. So what do we do with this? Is the Bible actually okay with this? Well, the short and simple answer is no, it's not okay. Polygamy is not good. It's dumb. Don't do it. Don't have multiple wives. There's your short answer. But we have to go all the way back to the very beginning of the Bible to see exactly why. God creates everything, and he creates Adam and Eve. He creates human beings, male and female, and then he institutes marriage. He actually starts the first marriage between Adam and Eve, and he says this. He says, a man will leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, singular, and he says the two will become one flesh. So this is God's created order. This is God's design for marriage, is that one man and one woman would come together as husband and wife for a lifetime. That's God's design for marriage. And God is showing his perfect plan in creation to let us know, but before sin enters into the world, to let us know that marriage is a man and a woman for a lifetime. So then what happens after that? Well, the fall happens. Sin comes into the world. Adam and Eve rebel against God, and all sorts of stuff gets messed up. And in the very next chapter, in Genesis chapter 4, you see a genealogy, and then you're introduced to a guy named Lamech. Now, it says Lamech had 2 wives. And it doesn't say there, and Lamech shouldn't have had 2 wives, but if you remember God's created order, that should raise a red flag. It does, shortly after that, say Lamech killed a guy, and then he bragged about it to his 2 wives. So Lamech is not exactly a guy that we ought to imitate in this life, right? So Lamech has these 2 wives, and then after that, you see a repeated pattern in the Old Testament where lots and lots of characters have multiple wives. But there's also this pattern that anytime a major character of the Bible has multiple wives, problems tend to come after that. Take a guy like Jacob, for example. Jacob is a really famous example where he has multiple wives, and then for the rest of their lives, these wives are enemies and they're rivals against each other because Jacob loves one more than he loves the other one. And there's all sorts of problems that come up after that. If you look again at King David has multiple wives, and then he ends up having relationship issues for the rest of his life. He's really has a dysfunctional life after he takes all sorts of wives. And then his son, Solomon, is crazy. He's got like hundreds of wives, and those wives end up leading him away from the Lord. There's nowhere in the Bible that says so-and-so was better off because they had multiple wives. They were better off because of the multiple wives than they would have been if they had just had one wife. It's never like that. In the Bible, having multiple wives is never cast in a positive light, even if it's not explicitly condemned in that particular spot. But whenever you come to the New Testament, it becomes much more clear. In the New Testament, first of all, Jesus points us back to Genesis chapter 2, wherever God says that a man shall leave his father and his mother and shall hold fast to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Jesus quotes that and points us back and says, hey, all right, let's reset this. Remember, this is how God created it. It's supposed to be one man, one woman. This is God's design for marriage. And then later on in the New Testament, you see other passages. One example is that there's restrictions placed that anyone who wants to be a leader in the church has to be a husband of just one wife. Now, why is it an important thing? Why is it such a big deal in the New Testament? Well, Paul tells us in the New Testament that marriage points us to something, that marriage is a picture of the gospel. That just like Christ loved the church, and it says that Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Christ was faithful to this church. Marriage is supposed to point to that. Just like he was loved and gave himself up for the church, Husbands are to love and to give themselves up for their wives. Husbands are to be faithful to their wife. And so whenever we take marriage in any direction other than the way that God created it and the way that God designed it, it actually speaks lies about the gospel. It speaks lies about how Jesus has loved his church, and that's a serious thing. So, whenever we read the Old Testament, whenever we come across these characters who are married to a bunch of women, it ought to raise a red flag for us. We shouldn't look at it and say, oh, well, David's generally a pretty good guy and he had lots of wives, so I must be able to imitate that. No, David is acting disobediently. He's not acting wisely. So a red flag should go off and it should say, okay, there's going to be a problem here. Something is going to come of this because this is not the way that God designed it. The Bible is not okay with polygamy.